The Lonely Princess. Princess Zyra stood on the grand balcony of the royal palace, looking at the twin moons of Zethar. The silver light bathed the city below, where countless aliens moved about, living their lives. But up here, in the golden halls of the Empire, she felt utterly alone. Tonight was supposed to be special. It was the night of her final suitor's arrival. The last noble warrior had come to ask for her hand in marriage. She had waited for this moment for years, hoping, praying, that this time, things would be different. But the answer was always the same. "I'm sorry, Your Highness," her father's deep voice echoed behind her. Emperor Zarath stood tall, his royal robes shimmering in the moonlight. His face, usually stern and unreadable, softened just a little. "Lord Varric has rejected the offer. He says, you are unfit." Zyra turned slowly, her hands clenched at her sides. She should have expected it. Every Zethari male before him had said the same thing. But hearing it again, spoken by her own father, made it hurt even more. "Unfit," she repeated, her voice hollow. "Why? What did he say this time?" The Emperor hesitated. He was not a man who showed weakness, and perhaps he saw this moment as a sign of his own failure. "He said you are too different." Zyra let out a bitter laugh. "Different? You mean weak, too soft, too emotional." Her father's silence confirmed it. She had heard these words her whole life. In the Zethari Empire, strength was everything. Warriors ruled the stars. The greatest families married to create stronger bloodlines, powerful leaders, and fearless fighters. But Zyra, she was not like them. She was not weak. At least, not in the way they thought. She had trained in combat since childhood, learned the ways of the sword, the blaster, the starships. But where other Zethari warriors felt only rage and ambition, she felt something else. Compassion. She cried when she saw suffering. She cared about those below her station. She listened when others spoke, instead of demanding to be heard. In a world of warriors, she was something different, something they did not understand. And so, they rejected her. "I have no more suitors left, do I?" she asked softly. The Emperor did not answer. That was enough. She turned back to the city, blinking away the sting in her eyes. She would not cry, not in front of him. "There is one last option," her father said after a long pause. Zyra frowned. "Who?" "A human." She turned sharply. "A what?" The Emperor folded his arms. "Earth has been growing in power. Their influence in the Galactic Council is rising. We need an alliance. The human ambassador, Captain James Carter, is arriving tomorrow. His people have suggested a marriage as a political bond." Zyra stared at him in disbelief. A human. The primitive species that other empires mocked. The weak, fragile creatures with their short lives and emotional hearts. Even the Zethari, who respected power above all, barely acknowledged them. And now she was expected to consider marrying one. She wanted to laugh at the irony. She was rejected by every Zethari male, but a human, an outsider, was being offered as her last hope. "Do I have a choice?" she asked. The Emperor's golden eyes narrowed. "You always have a choice." But our empire does not." She understood what he meant. The empire needed alliances. The Zethari were strong, but strength alone was not enough in a changing galaxy. Still, the thought of marrying a human, someone who did not even belong in her world, felt like an insult. A final proof that she was not worthy of her own people. "I will meet him," she said at last, her voice firm. "But I make no promises." The Emperor nodded. "That is all I ask." As he walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts, Zyra felt the weight of the decision settle in her chest. A human. Could someone from such a weak species ever understand her? Could someone who did not share her world, her culture, her pain, ever see her for who she truly was? She doubted it. And yet, deep inside, a small voice whispered, "What if he is different?" Zaira looked up at the twin moons again, their silver light casting long shadows over the palace. Tomorrow, she would meet Captain James Carter, and for the first time in her life, her fate would be in the hands of someone who was not Zethari. Would he reject her too? Or would this human surprise them all? A human among the stars. The grand halls of the Zethari Palace had never seen a creature like him before. Captain James Carter walked through the towering entrance, his boots echoing against the polished obsidian floors. The palace guards, tall, armored Zethari warriors with sharp horns and piercing golden eyes, watched him with open contempt. To them, he was nothing. A weak, soft-boned human, a creature from a young world, with no claws, no fangs, and no real power. And yet here he was. James had been in countless diplomatic meetings, but this was different. He wasn't just here to negotiate trade routes or peace treaties. He was here because of her. Princess Zaira. The woman no Zethari warrior wanted. The woman whose name was whispered in the halls of power, not as a ruler or a warrior, but as an embarrassment. James didn't care about any of that. He had read the reports. He had seen the files. A brilliant strategist, an excellent pilot, and yet she was cast aside, rejected by her own people for reasons that made no sense to him. He didn't believe in destiny, but something about this meeting felt important. The throne room doors slid open, revealing the grand chamber within. A golden throne sat high on a raised platform, where Emperor Zarath looked down at him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Around him stood noble warriors, advisors, and military leaders. Their expressions ranged from amusement to outright hostility. And then there was her. Princess Zaira stood beside her father, clad in royal armor that shimmered in the light. She was striking, tall, elegant, with silver blue skin and deep violet eyes that burned with something fierce. Not just beauty, something more. But there was no warmth in her gaze as she studied him. James inclined his head in a respectful bow. "Your Majesty." "Princess Zaira." The Emperor leaned forward. "You are the human representative." "I am." James met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Captain James Carter of the United Earth Fleet, I appreciate the honor of this audience." A low murmur passed through the room. The warriors exchanged glances, as if surprised by his confidence. "You speak boldly for one so fragile," the Emperor mused. James smirked. "I've been called worse." A few warriors chuckled. Others scowled. Zaira, however, remained silent. Her gaze flickered over him, unreadable. "You are aware," the Emperor continued, "that this discussion is not merely about politics, but something far greater, a bond between empires, a union." James nodded. "I understand. And yet you still stand here." He shrugged. "Should I not?" The Emperor narrowed his eyes. "Do you truly believe a human could ever be worthy of a Zethari princess?" Silence filled the chamber. The question hung in the air, heavy with expectation. James glanced at Zaira. She was watching him closely now, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, he spoke. "Worth is a strange thing, Your Majesty. It's not just about strength. It's about loyalty, honor, the ability to stand when others fall." His voice didn't waver. "Humans may not have claws or fangs, but we have something else. When the odds are against us, when the world tells us we are nothing, we rise." He let the words settle. The Emperor studied him, then leaned back, stroking his chin. "Imph, you speak well, human." One of the Zethari nobles stepped forward, sneering. "Words are easy, but a human? A species ruled by weakness and emotions. They are soft, fragile creatures. Even the princess deserves better than this thing." James turned to the noble, smiling. "And yet, here I stand, while every Zethari warrior before me has failed." The noble's face darkened. Others chuckled again, entertained by his boldness. But Zaira, for the first time, she looked intrigued. Her voice cut through the air. "You are different from what I expected, Captain." James met her gaze. "Is that good or bad?" Her lips quirked in the slightest smirk. "I haven't decided yet." The Emperor tapped his fingers on the armrest. "Very well. Since you are so confident, you shall prove yourself. A Zethari does not earn respect through words alone. If you wish to stand beside my daughter, you must pass the trial of worth." The room fell silent. Zyra's smirk vanished. "Father, that is not." "It is my will," the Emperor said firmly. "If the human wants to stay, let him earn his place, as any Zethari warrior would." James tilted his head. "What kind of trial?" A low, rumbling laugh spread through the room. The warriors grinned, exchanging knowing glances. Zyra's eyes hardened. "It is a test that no outsider has ever survived." James considered this for a moment. Then he smiled. "Sounds fun." A ripple of shock passed through the crowd. The Emperor himself looked mildly impressed. Zyra stared at him as if trying to figure out whether he was brave or just insane. Either way, tomorrow, James would face a challenge unlike any he had ever known. And Zyra would watch closely, because for the first time in her life, she wanted to believe. The forbidden bond. The arena was silent. Not the kind of silence that came from peace, but the silence before something brutal, something inevitable. The kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of James Carter's neck stand up. He stood in the center of a massive circular coliseum, deep beneath the Zethari Palace. The walls stretched high, the stands packed with alien nobility, warriors, and spectators eager to see him fail. Golden banners hung from towering columns, their symbols glowing in the dim torchlight. At the far end, sitting on a raised platform, was Emperor Zarath himself, flanked by his most trusted advisors. But James's eyes weren't on the Emperor. They were on her. Princess Zyra stood beside her father, her hands clenched tightly behind her back. She had told him not to do this. "This is madness," she had whispered to him before the trial began. No human has ever faced the trial of worth. Even full-blooded Zethari warriors die in this arena. James had simply grinned. "Guess I'll have to be the first." Now, staring at the massive iron gate across the arena, he was beginning to realize she hadn't been exaggerating. The ground trembled as the doors groaned open. From the darkness beyond, a monstrous beast emerged. 12 feet tall, covered in thick armored plating with a maw full of jagged fangs. Its 4 glowing yellow eyes locked onto James, and the crowd erupted into cheers. "Ah," James muttered under his breath. "Of course, it's a giant murder lizard." The announcer's voice echoed through the Colosseum. "Captain James Carter of the United Earth Fleet, your test begins now. Defeat the Karthok, and prove your worth." The Karthok let out a guttural snarl and charge. James dodged just as the beast's massive claws slammed into the ground where he had been standing. Dust and shattered stone flew into the air. He rolled, coming up on one knee, heart pounding. He wasn't the biggest. He wasn't the strongest. But he was fast. The beast lunged again. James ducked under a swipe, drawing his plasma dagger. He slashed at its exposed underbelly, but the blade barely scratched its thick hide. Crap. The crowd laughed, mocking him. The Zethari warriors smirked, shaking their heads. Weak. Soft. Human. But Sarah wasn't laughing. She was watching, eyes narrowed, analyzing. James gritted his teeth. He needed a plan. A direct fight was suicide. He couldn't overpower this thing. But maybe he didn't have to. He dodged another strike, this time noting the beast's movements, its speed, its pattern, the way its weight shifted. Every time it lunged, it left its back legs exposed for a split second. That was his opening. He sprinted toward the Colosseum walls. The Karthok roared and charged after him. At the last second, James leaped onto a fallen pillar, kicked off the wall, and flipped over the beast's head. The crowd gasped. The Karthok skidded to a stop, confused. James landed behind it, grabbing a spear from the ground and driving it deep into the back of the creature's knee. The beast howled, stumbling. The audience noise shifted. Laughter turned to murmurs. The human was still standing. James yanked the spear free, dodging again. He was making it bleed now. Above him, Syra leaned forward. For the first time, she saw something in this human that she had never seen in her own people. Not just courage. Defiance. The Karthok roared in rage and charged again. But this time, James was ready. He rolled under its legs, using its own momentum against it. As it crashed into the stone wall, dazed, he leaped onto its back and drove his plasma dagger into the soft flesh at the base of its skull. The beast spasmed, then collapsed. The Colosseum fell into stunned silence. James Carter stood, panting, covered in dust and sweat. The human had won. The Emperor stood slowly, his expression unreadable. The nobles whispered among themselves, some furious, some impressed. And Syra. She felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Admiration. Respect. She met James's gaze from across the arena, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she had met someone who truly understood what it meant to be an outsider. Someone like her. The Emperor's voice finally broke the silence. You have passed the trial, human, but this does not mean you are worthy of my daughter. James smirked, wiping the sweat from his brow. Well, I guess we'll just have to see about that. Syra's breath caught. The human wasn't just brave. He was reckless, foolish, and completely unafraid of standing up to the most powerful empire in the galaxy. And for some reason, she liked that. The trial of worth. James Carter had barely caught his breath when the next challenge was announced. The trial of worth wasn't just a battle, it was a series of impossible tests designed to break warriors in every possible way. Most Zethari barely survived the first stage. The second was meant to separate the strong from the truly elite. And the third? The third was a death sentence for anyone unworthy. James was about to find out which category he belonged to. The Emperor's voice echoed across the grand chamber, his golden eyes locked onto James. You have defeated the Karthok, Zarath said, his tone measured. But brute strength is not enough to stand beside a Zethari princess. You must prove intelligence, strategy, resilience. James smirked. So what's next? A pop quiz? The warriors surrounding the throne sneered at his insolence, but the Emperor merely gestured to the massive doors behind him. You will face the labyrinth of ordeals. James's smirk faded slightly. Labyrinth? That sounds ominous. Inside, the Emperor continued, you will encounter obstacles that will test your mind as well as your body. You must navigate the maze, solve its puzzles, and survive its dangers. Only then will you be worthy to continue. James exhaled. Right. A monster and a maze. Just another day in the office. From the side, Syra was watching him intently. Are you sure about this, human? She asked. James met her gaze. You tell me, princess. You think I can handle it? Syra hesitated. She had been raised to believe humans were weak, that they lacked the strength, discipline, and sheer willpower of the Zethari. But this man, she wasn't so sure anymore. Before she could answer, the doors creaked open. The labyrinth awaited. The labyrinth of ordeals. The doors slammed shut behind James, sealing him in total darkness. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a faint blue light flickered along the walls, illuminating intricate carvings, maps, symbols, and ancient warnings written in a language he didn't understand. The floor beneath him shifted. The walls groaned as the entire labyrinth moved. James took a slow breath. All right. First step. Don't panic. The Zethari were warriors, but he was a soldier. That meant he thought differently. The key to survival wasn't brute force. It was adaptability. His first challenge came almost immediately. As he stepped forward, a row of razor-sharp blades shot out from the walls, slicing through the air where he had just been standing. He barely dodged in time, rolling to the side. "Great," he muttered. "So it's one of those mazes." Moving carefully, he advanced, analyzing every inch of the path ahead. The walls were full of traps, pressure plates, shifting tiles, hidden dart launchers. Someone who relied on strength alone would have been dead 5 times over by now. Meanwhile, outside the labyrinth, the audience watched in silence, the massive viewing screens displaying James's progress. Many expected him to die in the first 5 minutes, but he was still moving. Zara found herself gripping the edge of the balcony railing. Her people had designed this trial to test warriors, but James wasn't fighting like a traditional warrior. He wasn't charging blindly into danger. He was thinking, calculating every step. "Interesting," she muttered under her breath. The Emperor noticed her expression, but said nothing. He, too, was beginning to see something in the human that he had not expected. But the real test was still to come. Deeper into the labyrinth, James reached a massive stone door covered in alien symbols. A puzzle. "Of course," he muttered, "because nearly dying isn't enough. I have to solve riddles too." The symbols on the door seemed to shift as he studied them. A single phrase, written in an ancient Zethari dialect, glowed above. "Only the worthy may pass. The unworthy shall be lost forever." James exhaled. Right. No pressure. His instincts told him the answer wasn't brute force. He knelt, examining the symbols closely. That's when he noticed something. The patterns weren't random. They matched the constellations outside the palace. A test of intelligence. He pressed his fingers against the correct sequence, aligning the symbols with the star maps he had memorized from the briefings. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, RUMMMBI. The massive stone door slid open, revealing the final chamber. James grinned. All right. Time for the final boss fight. The final challenge. The moment James stepped inside, the air changed. A massive figure stood in the center of the chamber, clad in ancient battle armor. It wasn't just any warrior. It was an elder guardian. 10 feet tall, covered in ceremonial plating, its glowing red eyes locked onto him. A mechanical voice echoed through the chamber. Only those who face their fears may pass. James barely had time to react before the guardian charge. He dodged, barely avoiding the swing that could have shattered his skull. The thing was fast, stronger than anything he had faced before. There was no time to think. James ducked, weaving through the guardian's attacks. His mind raced. The brute force approach wouldn't work. That's when he noticed something. The guardian's armor was old, not indestructible. There, on the back of its left knee, was a crack in the plating. James smirked. Gotcha. He feinted left, drawing the guardian into an attack, then dove forward, sliding beneath it. With precise aim, he jammed his plasma dagger into the weak point. A roar filled the chamber as the guardian staggered. James rolled free, grabbing a fallen spear and driving it deep into the exposed joint. With one final, shuddering movement, the guardian collapsed. Silence. Then, the chamber doors swung open. James Carter had done the impossible. Outside the labyrinth. When James emerged, covered in dust and sweat, the entire audience was on their feet. They weren't mocking him anymore. They were cheering. The Emperor himself stood, his golden eyes full of something James hadn't seen before. Respect. You have passed the labyrinth of ordeals, the Emperor announced. And yet you are still only human. James wiped his forehead, smirking. Funny how that keeps happening, huh? A few warriors chuckled. Even the Emperor gave the smallest hint of a smile. But James wasn't looking at him. He was looking at Syra. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she wasn't just intrigued. She was impressed. The dark betrayal. The palace halls were not safe anymore. James Carter had earned the respect of the Zethari people. He had bested their warriors, survived their brutal trials, and proven himself in ways no human ever had. The nobles who once sneered at him now whispered his name with wary admiration. But admiration was not the same as acceptance. And for some, his success was an insult. The night before the coronation, James sat on the balcony of the palace guest quarters, gazing at the twin moons of Zethar. His body ached from the trials, but his mind was sharper than ever. You should be resting. He turned to see Xyra stepping onto the balcony. She was dressed in a flowing dark robe, her silver-blue skin illuminated by the soft moonlight. James grinned. You sound worried about me, princess. Sarah folded her arms. You should be worried about yourself. You've made powerful enemies today. James's grin faded. Yeah, I noticed a few nobles looked ready to stab me with their fancy daggers. Xyra didn't smile. It is more than that, she said quietly. There are those who would rather see you dead than allow a human to stand beside me. James studied her face. There was something there, something deeper than concern. Are you saying someone might try something tonight? He asked. Xyra hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, I don't know, but I would not underestimate their hatred. James exhaled. Well, good thing I don't sleep much. Xyra shook her head. This is not a joke, Carter. His smirk softened. I know. They stood in silence for a moment. Then, before she turned to leave, Xyra added, Be careful, human. James watched her go, something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Then his instincts screamed at him. A shadow moved in the far corner of the balcony. James spun. Too late. A sharp sting at his neck. His vision blurred. And then, darkness. The coup begins. James woke to the sound of alarms. His head was spinning. His limbs felt sluggish. He tried to move but found himself chained to a cold metal chair in a dimly lit chamber. A figure stepped forward. Lord Varric. James recognized him immediately, one of the most powerful Zethari nobles, a staunch traditionalist who had openly opposed James from the start. I was hoping you would put up more of a fight, human, Varric sneered. But I suppose even the strongest of your kind are still weak. James forced a smirk. Kidnapping me in my sleep. Real honorable of you, big guy. Varric's expression darkened. You do not belong here, and you will not stand beside our princess. The thought of it is an insult to our bloodline. James tested his restraints. Too tight. The drugs were still dulling his reflexes. Let me guess, he said. You're planning to make my death look like an accident. Varric chuckled. Not quite. We will make it appear as if you ran. That you abandoned the princess, proving once and for all that humans are unworthy. James clenched his jaw. If they succeeded, everything he had fought for would be erased. And worse, Xyra would believe he had betrayed her. You're making a mistake, Varric, James said, his voice low. Varric smirked. No, human. The mistake was ever thinking you belonged in our world. He turned to his guards. Take him to the execution chambers. Make sure he is never found. James watched as they approached. And then, the walls exploded. The princess's defiance. Xyra had felt something was wrong. When James didn't appear at breakfast, she knew. When her father's guards refused to answer her questions, she knew. And when she overheard Lord Varric speaking in hushed tones with his conspirators, she acted. Now, she stood in the middle of the shattered chamber, her plasma blade drawn, the smoke from the blast still curling in the air. Varric staggered back, his eyes wide with shock. Princess. Xyra didn't hesitate. She moved faster than James had ever seen, her blade slicing through the guards in a series of deadly arcs. They fell before they even had a chance to react. Varric snarled, drawing his own weapon. You would betray your own people for this human. Xyra's violet eyes burned with fury. You betrayed me the moment you tried to take my choice away, she snapped. James, still groggy, managed to grin. Remind me to never get on your bad side. Xyra slashed through his restraints, pulling him to his feet. Can you fight? James rolled his stiff shoulders. I'll manage. Varric's forces regrouped. More guards stormed in, weapons drawn. James picked up a fallen blaster. All right, Princess, he said, cocking it. Let's show them what happens when they mess with a human and a real Zethari. Syra smirked. Try to keep up. And then together, they fought. The fall of a traitor. The battle was fast and brutal. James, still weakened, relied on his quick thinking and precise shooting. Syra, however, was like a storm, moving with lethal precision, her plasma blade cutting down every traitor that stood in her way. Varric, realizing he was losing, tried to flee. James saw it first. Oh, hell no, he muttered. He raised his blaster, aiming at the control panel above Varric's escape route. One shot. A direct hit. The ceiling collapsed in front of the traitor, blocking his path. Syra stepped forward, her blade humming as she pressed it against Varric's throat. This is treason, she said coldly. Varric spat at her feet. You think they will accept you after this? You have doomed yourself. Syra glanced at James. He gave her a small nod. Her grip tightened on her blade. But instead of killing Varric, she turned to the guards who had remained loyal. Arrest him, she ordered. Varric's eyes widened. You cannot. The guards grabbed him, forcing him to his knees. James let out a breath. Well, that was dramatic. Syra turned to him. You are unarmed. He grinned. Only my pride. I let myself get kidnapped way too easily. Syra hesitated. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she stepped closer and placed a hand on his chest. You did not betray me, she said softly. James tilted his head. Did you think I would? For the first time, Syra looked uncertain. James smiled. I don't run, Princess. Not from a fight. And definitely not from you. She held his gaze, and this time she believed him. The Emperor's judgment. Hours later, as the dust settled, James and Syra stood before the Emperor. He looked at them both, his daughter, and the human who had defied every expectation. You had the chance to kill Varric, Zorath said, yet you showed mercy. Syra lifted her chin. Because we are better than him. The Emperor's gaze shifted to James. And you, human, you did not run. James crossed his arms. I told you, Your Majesty, humans rise. Silence stretched between them. Then, to James's utter shock, the Emperor laughed. Perhaps, he said, I was wrong about you. James raised an eyebrow. I get that a lot. Syra smirked. And just like that, everything had changed. The ultimate choice. The throne room was silent. Not the heavy, expectant silence of respect, but the sharp, uneasy silence before an execution. James Carter stood in the center of the grand chamber, his body still aching from the battles of the previous night. Syra stood beside him, her expression unreadable, but her eyes burning with quiet determination. Before them, Emperor Zorath sat on his golden throne, his face impassive, his hands resting on the armrests carved with ancient symbols of war. At his feet, bound in chains, knelt Lord Varric, the noble who had tried to destroy James, the traitor who had plotted to seize power. His face was bruised, his pride shattered, but his eyes still burned with hatred. The entire court was watching. Noble warriors, high-ranking officials, and the most powerful leaders of the Zethari Empire lined the chamber walls, their expressions ranging from anger to curiosity. Some still despised James, refusing to believe a human had proven himself worthy. Others, though, had begun to whisper that perhaps the galaxy was changing. And now it was time for the Emperor's final decision. The Emperor speaks. You have both caused me great difficulty, Emperor Zorath said at last, his voice echoing through the hall. His golden eyes moved between his daughter and the human who had defied every expectation. Syra, he continued, you disobeyed my orders, led an attack against one of our own nobles, and openly defied the traditions of our people. The princess did not look away, because he betrayed us all. Zarath's gaze was sharp, and yet you chose to spare him. He deserved justice, not revenge, Dira said firmly. A murmur spread through the nobles. Mercy was not a trait often shown among the Zethari. The emperor turned his attention to James. And you, human. His voice was quieter now, but no less dangerous. You could have left. You could have taken your victory and gone home. But you stayed. You risked your life, not just for my daughter, but for my empire. James shrugged. Well, I hate unfinished business. A few of the younger warriors chuckled. The older nobles did not. You have proven your strength, the emperor admitted. You have even proven your intelligence. But the question remains, have you proven your worth? The chamber grew tense. Zarath stood, his imposing figure casting a long shadow over them. You both claim to have acted for the good of the empire, he said, his voice like thunder. Very well. Let us put that to the test. He turned to Xyra. You must make a choice. The impossible decision. A ripple of shock spread through the court. Xyra's back straightened. What do you mean? She asked carefully. The emperor's face was unreadable. You have defied my will, but I will give you a chance to prove that your actions were not driven by emotion, but by wisdom. He gestured to the guards. 2 warriors stepped forward, carrying something between them, an ornate ceremonial blade, its silver edge gleaming under the chamber's lights. Zarath's voice was final. You may take your place as heir to the throne, if you prove your loyalty to your people. The meaning was clear. James had earned the respect of many. He had even impressed the emperor himself. But tradition could not be ignored. A human could never truly be part of the Zethari Empire. And so, the emperor had given her a way out. If Xyra took the blade, if she denounced James, if she cast him aside in front of the entire court, then all would be forgiven, her honor restored, her title secured, her future as empress assured. All she had to do was let him go. The court held its breath. James did not move. He had seen enough political games to know when he was being used as a pawn. He also knew that this was not his fight. This was Xyra's decision. Still, he couldn't stop himself from saying, well, this is awkward. Xyra ignored him. Her eyes locked onto her father's. You are asking me to betray someone who risked everything for us, she said, her voice even. I am asking you to prove where your loyalty lies, Zarath corrected. Do you stand with your people, or with him? Silence stretched between them. The nobles watched, waiting for her to take the blade. James finally sighed. Look, princess, I get it. Your father's giving you a way to fix everything. I won't hold it against you if you... Shut up, Carter. James blinked. Xyra turned, and for the first time, there was no doubt, no hesitation, no fear. You are my people, she said. Then she did something no one expected. She reached forward, and instead of taking the blade, she took James's hand. Gasps filled the chamber. Varric's snarl of fury echoed through the halls. This is madness. You would choose a human over your own people, over your own throne. Xyra didn't even look at him. My throne is not for you to decide, she said coolly. The chamber erupted into chaos. Some nobles shouted in outrage. Others whispered in disbelief. The younger warriors, those who had begun to admire James, exchanged uncertain glances. For the first time in history, a Zethari royal had chosen a path no one had foreseen. A path of her own. The emperor's verdict. Zarath watched his daughter in silence. For a long moment, he said nothing. The noise of the court grew louder. Warriors demanding punishment, nobles demanding justice, Varric still shouting in rage. And then, the emperor lifted his hand. The chamber fell silent. Zarath's golden eyes met Cyrus. Then so be it. The words struck like a hammer. James barely had time to register what had happened before the Emperor turned to his guards. Varric has conspired against the crown and dishonored this court. Take him to the dungeons. He will answer for his crimes. The disgraced noble roared in fury as he was dragged away, but no one came to his defense. The moment he was gone, Zarath turned back to James and Tyra. "Etc.," he said, his tone unreadable. "You have made your choice. The consequences are yours to bear." She did not waver. "I accept them." A long silence. Then, slowly, the Emperor nodded. "Then let us see what the future brings." And with that, he turned, walking away, leaving the entire court stunned. James exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, that could have gone worse. Etc. gave him a look. "Do you ever take things seriously?" He grinned. "Only when I have to." She sighed, shaking her head. "You are impossible, Carter." He leaned in slightly. "And yet you still picked me." She didn't deny it. And as the court tried to process what had just happened, as the future of the Zetheri Empire shifted forever, James Carter and Princess Vyra walked out of the throne room together. Side by side. The final stand. The palace was burning. Smoke curled through the grand halls of the Zetheri Empire's heart, staining the golden banners with ash. The clash of plasma weapons, the roar of warriors locked in brutal combat, and the distant explosions of sabotage filled the air. The coup had begun. Lord Varric may have been arrested, but his supporters had not vanished. No, they had been waiting, watching for the perfect moment to strike. And when Princess Vyra chose James Carter, when she rejected the will of the Zetheri elite, they saw their chance. Now, the Empire itself was at war, and at its center, standing in the throne room as battle raged outside, were James and Tyra. The betrayal runs deep. James ducked behind a fallen pillar, plasma fire streaking past his head. He tapped his communicator, cursing under his breath. "Hey, not to alarm anyone, but we got about 20 heavily armed maniacs trying to turn this place into rubble. Could use some backup." The reply came through static. "Carter, the palace security systems have been hijacked. Reinforcements are locked out." James clenched his jaw. "Perfect. Love that for us." Zyra slid into cover beside him, her breathing steady despite the chaos. She wiped blood from her cheek, her violet eyes scanning the battlefield. "They planned this well," she muttered. "Too well. Someone inside helped them." James exhaled sharply. "Yeah, because our lives weren't already complicated enough." Zyra's grip on her plasma blade tightened. "If they reach my father, they won't." James met her gaze. "We won't let them." She held his stare for a second longer, then nodded. "Then we fight. A battle worthy of legends." They moved as one. James rolled forward, snapping off precise blaster shots that sent two traitors sprawling. Thyra followed in a flash of silver and violet, her plasma blade cutting through another before they could react. The air filled with the scent of scorched metal and burning fabric. The enemy was skilled. These weren't ordinary rebels. These were trained warriors, Zetheri elites who had sworn allegiance to Varric's cause. And they wanted James dead. One charged him, a towering brute with serrated armor and a warhammer crackling with energy. James barely dodged in time, the weapon smashing into the marble floor, sending cracks through the stone. He fired, but the brute deflected the shot with an energy shield. "Okay," James muttered. "That's cheating." The brute swung again. James rolled backward, grabbed a fallen plasma sword, and T-Lang. The impact rattled his arms as he barely blocked the strike. The brute sneered. "You are nothing, human." James grinned, shifting his weight. "Yeah. Then why am I still standing?" He pivoted, ducking low, and drove the plasma sword straight into the brute's exposed side. The warrior staggered, eyes wide, then collapsed. "One down," James panted, wiping sweat from his forehead. 1,000,000 to go. Sarah's moment of truth. Zyra fought like a storm. She wasn't just defending her throne. She was proving to her people that she was their rightful ruler. Every strike of her blade was precise. Every move was a statement. But then, she saw him, a lone figure moving through the battle, slipping past the chaos, heading toward the throne room doors, heading toward her father. Zyra's heart lurched. "The Emperor," she shouted. James followed her gaze. The traitor was already at the entrance. If he reached Zarath, it was over. They had to stop him. Without thinking, Zyra sprinted. James cursed but followed. The final confrontation. The doors slammed open, revealing the Emperor standing in the center of the throne room, his golden cloak stained with battle. And before him, the true mastermind of the coup. It wasn't Varek. It was General Kaler, the Emperor's own military strategist, a man who had fought in 100 battles, who had been at Zarath's side for decades. Now, he stood with a plasma rifle aimed at the Emperor's heart. "Kaler," Zarath said, his voice calm despite the betrayal. "So it was you." The general smirked. "You have grown weak, old friend, allowing humans to stand among us, allowing your daughter to throw away her bloodline for this." He spat the last word like poison. James and Zyra burst into the room, weapons raised. Kaler sighed. "Ah, and here they are, the future of the Empire." His grip on the rifle tightened. "I think not." He fired. Zyra moved faster than thought. She threw herself forward, deflecting the shot with her plasma blade, the energy crackling as it dissipated. Kaler's eyes narrowed. "You would betray your people, your legacy, for him." Zyra didn't blink. "I would betray no one." She launched herself at him. Kaler was fast, but Zyra was faster. Their blades clashed, filling the chamber with bursts of white-hot light. Sparks rained down as they moved, their battle a blur of motion. James saw an opening. Kaler was too focused on Zyra. James raised his blaster. "Hey, General," he called. Kaler turned, too late. James fired. The shot struck Kaler's weapon, sending it flying from his hands. Zyra didn't hesitate. Her blade found its mark. Kaler staggered, eyes wide with disbelief. "You would choose him over your own people," he rasped. Zyra held his gaze. "I am my people." With a final push, she drove the blade home. Kaler collapsed. The coup was over. The dawn of a new era. The battle outside ended soon after. The rebels, leaderless and broken, surrendered. The Emperor stood before his people, his gaze sweeping across the throne room. He had seen war. He had seen conquest. And now he had seen something new. "Tyra," he said at last. She turned, meeting his eyes. "You have proven yourself, not as my daughter, but as the future of this empire." A murmur spread through the nobles. Some still resisted the idea of a human standing beside their princess, but none could deny what they had seen. Zarath looked at James. "You," he said, "are the most frustrating human I have ever met." James grinned. "I get that a lot." The Emperor exhaled, then nodded. "Then I suppose I must get used to it." Zyra's breath caught. "You mean?" The Emperor turned to the court. "Let it be known," he declared, "that James Carter has proven himself in battle, in wisdom, and in loyalty. He stands among us not as an outsider, but as one of our own." James blinked. "Wait, did I just get knighted?" Zyra let out a breathless laugh. The crowd erupted into noise. Some cheered, some protested, but none could change what had happened. History had been rewritten. And as Zyra looked at James, this reckless, impossible human who had changed everything, she smiled. "You really are impossible, Carter." He smirked. "Yeah, but you picked me anyway." She did, and together they would lead the future.